Howdy folks, welcome to another episode of DevOps Diaries, and today I have a very special guest, Mr. Jon Robinson. Jon, welcome to the DevOps Diaries podcast, sir.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Pleasure is all mine. Jon, you are somebody that lives and breathes QA. Long career in QA and 5 years at Provar, very well known testing company in our Salesforce space, and now head of Salesforce at Test Sigma. Great journey. What gets you buzzed about QA?
It probably goes back to my origin story in QA. It was completely by accident, but my brain, the way it works, likes breaking stuff, and QA just happens to be really well suited for that. QA is supposed to be a pit stop on the way to figuring out what I wanted to do with my career, and that was 18 years ago. And I got into it and realized, man, I really like this thing because it just naturally fits the way my brain works. And, I get to creatively try and break stuff. I was always really good at it and never really knew that there was a career or field that actually allowed me to do that. But yeah, that's what it is I think it's just the ability to be creative in a way that, that's my sense of creativity is being able to, how can I break this thing that some really smart people have built? How can I do something creative with that? And that, to me, I enjoy that. And it's also, having spent so much time in the IT field in the past, my first career, so to speak, being proactive and being on the proactive side of things and being able to actually feel like I'm influencing the end product. At the end of the day, I think to me, that's really important because, my first 10 years or so of my career was spent in such a reactive mode where it was like always after the fact where I got to help people. And now in this case, I actually get to be proactive and saying, no, this isn't good enough. And, we need to be better than this. And that actually can make a difference. And that's pretty cool to me.
Absolutely. It's the white collar career for anarchists, maybe.
I've not heard that, but that is a very good description. It's, we're always the ones tasked with challenging authority, so to speak, because, most timelines and everything, everybody's like, we got to go. We got to get it out the door. And nobody's like, guys, no, we can't. It's not good enough. Like, we need to pull the brakes a little bit here.
Yeah, what you built is broken. Slow down.
Might want to actually make sure our users can use it first. It's cool. No, devs have tested. Yeah, no, I hear you, but we need to make sure it actually does what it's supposed to do first. Just word of caution. But yeah, doesn't always work. But at least somebody has stood up and said that.
Yeah, absolutely. Jon, what does QA mean in Salesforce? Because my experience in the ecosystem has been working with teams that are implementing Salesforce and focused on that DevOps lifecycle. Very occasionally, I would come across dedicated QA people as part of that process. So I still feel that QA is a relatively new or potentially underutilized function in a Salesforce delivery team. What is QA?
So, by and large, it's funny because QA and testing, if you will, depending on whether you're talking about the role or the function, those two terms kind of get intermingled a lot and confused with each other. And QA goes kind of beyond just the testing of the product. It's really looking at the overall delivery and making sure that what you're delivering is a quality product. Testing is a very large part of that, obviously. That is probably the largest part of it. But there are QA and quality related functions that happen all the way back during the ideation phase, right? Before you've ever put a line of code down, you're starting to think about, like, is this something that's actually going to be viable for the end user? And how do we ensure that that's the case as we go through the process of developing the user stories and building it and deploying it and going through the entire process of getting that release out? How do we make sure, like, what comes out the other side is actually what we intended to come out, right? And is actually going to be useful and viable for the customer? Because there is a scenario, and this happens a lot, where the product is built and you've tested it and it does exactly what you intended it to do, but the end user, it's not really viable for the end user because it could be a variety of factors. You didn't do enough market research. You fundamentally misunderstood what your customers needed. Whatever the case may be, there is a scenario where you could build it exactly what you intended to build, but what comes out the other end is not actually useful to the end user. And that is a function of QA as well, right? To make sure that those two things are in alignment and what you're actually delivering and what you're building is actually going to be a viable thing for the users. You're actually going to have somebody at the other side actually doing that testing as if they're a user and making sure that it's correct. And there's a variety of testing that can go along with it. But there's other just, I like to tell people the QA people are the voice of quality in the room, right? They're the people responsible for ensuring that quality is being upheld. And whatever that looks like, that's what their role or function is. And a lot of times that's going to be testing and doing all the metrics and the validations that go along with that. But sometimes that's more than that. And that's, I think that's the part that right now is largely misunderstood within the Salesforce ecosystem is there's a lot of testing that happens, but to your point, there's not really a bespoke quality person involved, right? This is their responsibility and they're the voice of quality for the project. Most of the times it's your admins or your BAs or your product owners or folks like that ended up doing the testing. And occasionally you'll get the specific QA people, but if you don't have somebody that's like responsible for quality, how do you ensure that you're actually delivering something of quality? Yeah.
So talk me, testing forms a big part of that. And I would say in a traditional team, for example, testing happens at the end before it gets shipped to production.
It is usually the last link in the chain.
the last hurdle, if you will.
Yep.
And folks and teams that I've spoken to, especially when it pertains to we need to buy a tool or a solution that will help us with testing, just because we don't really do any. Yeah. Is that it? Can buying a tool solve your problem? I guess, and I assume what I know the answer to this is going to be. But that seems to be kind of the way that a lot of folks in Salesforce approach this problem is buy a tool
100%.
that will solve it.
I mean, there's the magic bullet syndrome, right? They kind of think that buying a tool is going to solve their problems magically. And depending on what they're going into it with, sometimes that is true, right? Sometimes you just need the tool to do the thing you need it to do. The problem is, and this is the thing that's usually missing in a lot of those conversations, is what exactly are you expecting the tool to do? How is the tool going to help you specifically so that you make sure you get the right tool? Because just going out and picking a tool, there's a lot of whiz-bangy tools that do a lot of things. And a lot of them are very similar, but their approach is slightly different. And so understanding what you're wanting that tool to do, whether it's a DevOps tool, whether it's a data backup solution, whether it's a security tool, whether it's a test automation tool, doesn't really matter. Understanding what your actual needs are before you select the tool is important, because the number of times I've seen people say, oh, we need to do test automation, and go and choose a tool, and then they try and shoehorn their processes and how they work into what the tool is capable of doing instead of the other way around. That's where I see people get into trouble the most, is they're going into it without a real strong understanding of what they're trying to accomplish.
Yeah. How often do you see, we want to do test automation, what testing do you do now? None.
A shockingly high amount of times, because they want to skip the initial step, or they're doing what they think is testing ahead of time. And the reality is they're not. I had a customer at one time, like at the time it was one of my biggest deals, and they bought the product, they liked the product, they used it for small, really targeted things along the course of the year that they had the product. But at the end of the year, they're like, we can't justify spending the money we're spending on this because we're not getting overall value out of it. And we started talking to them, and they very quickly realized they weren't ready for test automation. They didn't know how to actually do testing. They were using test automation just as a Band-Aid for some other problems, right? They had specific challenges, or like, oh, we can use it for this, not like we need it for this. And they went back and they're like, we're not ready. Like over a 6-month time, it was like we did some workshops, we did some, working with the team to help them understand what testing means, what quality is, like how to go about setting up good best practices, et cetera. And they realized it just weren't ready for it. And that was I would rather that be the answer at the end of the day than trying to keep forcing it to work. They ended up coming back a year and a half later and said, okay, we think we've got this. We understand this. Now we're ready for it. We know where this is going to fit into our processes. That's a much different conversation, and you're much more likely to be successful.
Yeah, totally. And with you kind of alluded to it there. What does good testing look like in Salesforce?
I mean, the same as it looks like in any other product, by and large. The good testing looks like understanding what your desired outcomes are and making sure you're setting up a system that allows you to check that accordingly. Make sure you have a good test plan in place. Make sure you're effectively hitting all of the key aspects. It's no different from any other application inside or outside Salesforce. It's really going into it with a plan, sitting down and not just taking somebody's word for it. Oh, that works. I've seen it work on my machine, right? But like really having a genuine plan for what success is going to look like when you're done with that process. And recognizing that there are multiple stages to testing and not all testing is equal. The functional testing that you do during a sprint is very useful for ensuring that the developers do build what they said they built and that it's making it into the builds correctly. Like that is one sort of testing that typically happens in your sprints, and that can be handled one QA person on a team, etc. But then there's the regression testings that happen at the end of builds or right before releases that kind of covers everything when it's all brought together into a single platform, a single system. Things are touching each other for the first time. You might have some interactions that you just don't have in your dev sandboxes. Knowing what the plan is for when you get there, how you're going to get there, when do the teams do that, and knowing that just because you did it during the sprint and you tested this thing here doesn't mean you don't have to test that thing at the end as well, because at the end you now have to make sure it works with everything else. Those are fundamentally different things, and there's a slew of things that can happen in between there. You might have a smaller smoke test that says, here, every time we do a build, run this set of tests and make sure that it's correct. Those kinds of things are great for automation because they're repeatable. You're going to do them all the time. You can make sure you've got a good stable base to work from. Those are important. Again, the outcome and what you're intending for those tests is different than the other two tests that I mentioned. Even though they might use the same test cases, the outcome and what you're expecting from them is different. And I think understanding what that is really important.
Yeah, there's a high level of determinism, right, in testing that you expect across all levels, which allows you to create not only reliable applications, but like you said, fit for purpose applications.
And it's just understanding what you just said, right? That is a thing that people need to actually actively think about, and somebody needs to be responsible for thinking about that. A lot of times that goes unthought about or unconsidered as part of the larger planning, and then you get to the end and like, oh, how can we get this done in a short period of time? Which happens way more often than it should. I've yet to go into a place that has a well-defined process that doesn't happen. Even if they have a good process, that still happens.
Yeah. One of the things you did previous to where you are now is you helped build out like an education platform for testing to help move the needle for teams looking to adopt tooling and actually have some processes. You mentioned the large customer that you had there that wasn't quite ready for it and what have you. What was the drive with that included, I guess? What were some of the drivers to educating our community that spurred you to do that?
So one of the things that, I came, as I mentioned, from a non-Salesforce background before I joined Provar 6 years ago, 6.5 at this point. And the thing that was most shocking to me was how little knowledge the Salesforce community had about just things that I took for granted as best practices. And it started to become a recurring theme as we talked to customers, similar to the customer I mentioned, that as we would talk to them and start to discuss the challenges, a lot of the problems that they were running into were less about our tool, but more about how to use our tool within their organization. Like, where did we fit and what did good testing and good best practices look like? And initially that led to me doing a lot of workshops with customers, with prospects, trying to figure out where they were at, help them get a good base to start from, et cetera, and try and close that gap in the short term. But the more we started looking at it, the more we realized that this was a bigger, wider ecosystem level problem, right? This is something that in order to really, truly start to move the needle here, we were going to have to actually educate the ecosystem as a whole and start to get this information out there and start helping them to, before they ever got to the test automation point, right? They were already starting to learn about these things. So that was, we built an education platform. We focused on our tool, obviously, but we also included, just general QA topics. We included tools and best practices for things that were surrounding the quality process. So things like working with Jira, running effective Scrum sessions, things that all ultimately led to improved quality. These are things that I would do with regular quality teams when I would go into an organization. And we started there. We did some stuff on Trailhead as well. We had some courses. We were one of the first companies that actually put not targeted company specific or tool specific courses up, but rather testing, how to do good testing within Salesforce up on Trailhead. And that was so successful that they kept coming back and asking us to do more and more courses with them, because there is a lack of knowledge and information within this space that people just didn't know what to do. And that was really the thing that drove it, was we were trying to level up everybody. Yes, it ultimately helped us as a product, and that was important. And we needed something that taught our customers how to use our product. But the thing that we also needed was our customers to be, and prospects to be, informed on a level that they would come into conversations and we wouldn't have to spend weeks or months getting them to that point.
Yeah. What, through all of this journey, what is the baseline level knowledge of your average Salesforce team when it comes to testing, and where does it need to get to?
I think it's probably still, it's certainly gotten better over the last few years. One of the big things that I think has been a shift in a good direction for kind of where they're at today is, historically, Salesforce teams have largely been driven by the business side of the house, which means they're not really interacting with the IT teams, even in organizations that have fully staffed QA departments and, in some cases, world-class best practices that they've created and deployed. That kind of stuff is now starting to become more common practice, where you're starting to have the Salesforce teams taking advantage of in-house resources. And I think that helps a lot, whether they're staffing their teams with them or just relying on them for expertise and tooling, et cetera. That's helping to level set the kind of expectations there. The challenge is, as you know, one of the things that Salesforce does really well is appeals to what I call the everyman, right? They're very successful at the non-technical, the people that want to get into the tech field, but are not necessarily technically inclined. Historically, a lot of the QA profession has relied on a high level of technical expertise. Like you kind of need to fundamentally understand how things work to be a good tester, especially if you're talking about test automation. And one of the things that has been a good thing to see is kind of that starting to bleed over and take advantage of other resources available, within your organization, and leaning on them for advice and things. But the one thing, if there's something I said, okay, this is going to have to get better, it's starting to understand that for as much as the clicks not code mantra for Salesforce is really helped fuel and drive their growth, there is still an underlying level of technical understanding, I guess is the best way to put it. And the realization that QA and testing is kind of a separate function that needs to be treated as a separate function and not somebody's side job. I think we're getting better at accepting that testing is needed. We're still not quite there on, this is something that needs like somebody dedicated to be that voice of quality. That's where I think we're still lacking in what we need to get to. Because once we get there, I think it starts to snowball and drive itself. but until you've kind of recognized and given the resources to it. Because one of the things that means today is if you don't have that acceptance within an organization, the hardest thing to do is get resources. We're usually the last people to get resources.
Yeah, that makes sense. And traditionally, when I first joined, excuse me, the Salesforce ecosystem, probably around the same time that you joined Provar yourself. And when I looked at Salesforce testing, I knew Apex tests and unit testing. That was a thing that you have to do these to get it into Salesforce. And I because I don't spend too much, I haven't until the last year or so, haven't spent too much time like focused on testing and actually the whole robustness of delivering good applications. I do sometimes feel that people are just like, oh, testers or tests are Apex tests and unit tests, and there's still some notion that that's the only thing, because those are the only things that are required. And then to your clicks not code point, you talk about things like flows. Flows don't require any testing, but are executing complex business logic. Why are those two things not treated the same?
And I think this has been the challenge, especially within the QA/testing space in Salesforce, is for a long time, Salesforce kind of pushed that conversation in that direction, that you really don't need testing. We handle all that for you, right? You just have to worry about making sure your code built correctly, and then we'll handle the rest of it, right? And it's missing that layer. I mean, the number of people when I first started in this space and we talk about testing, and even today, like I went to the same conference I think you and I originally crossed paths at Northeast Dreamin' a few weeks ago. The number of people that asked me when we talked about we do test automation, the first question was, what do you mean Apex tests? Right? No, but within the Salesforce world, that is still largely what people mean when they mean testing, because that is really all Salesforce ever talks about when it comes to testing. They've started to talk about other things recently, but even that is largely targeted at specific things. You know, they announced that the testing stuff for Agentforce, which is really just for testing the agents created as part of Agentforce, not necessarily testing, you know, as a whole. They've got some things like UTAM that they've introduced to kind of help with the Lightning Web Component side of things, but it's targeted at that specific piece rather than the overall. You know, we need to test the overall deliverable as opposed to specific components of that deliverable. And I think that mindset comes from this whole unit testing, where we're testing the specific thing to make sure it's functional and ready to go. That's okay. That's still needed. Those are all important and necessary things, but it's only one step in the process. It's not kind of all of it.
Yeah. And I guess as an addition to that, with tests, you know, tests are only as good as they're written to some extent, right?
Well, I mean, it's the same reason why we really don't, as QA people, like it when developers test their own code. It's not necessarily that we don't trust you. In a lot of cases, we actually do trust you, and we actually think you're probably the one that understands what it's supposed to be doing the most. But one of the things that can happen as part of that is this unintentional blindness that you'll get for certain things or expectations, that because you know it happens, you just kind of overlook it, or you know, you have a different, your lens is through, did I build this correctly, as opposed to how is this being used. It's not a bad thing, it's a different thing. And yeah, like you said, it's very easy to, I mean, you can write something very poorly and you can create something very poor. In the same way, I can create 1,000 tests for a piece of functionality that don't actually tell you whether it is correct, but they are all functional and passing tests. That doesn't mean they're good tests. So in the same way that you've got challenges on the development side, from that standpoint, you got the same challenges on the QA side. Understanding what a good test is and how to effectively make sure something works, that's a skill in and of itself, same way development is.
Yeah. What's a good test? How is what makes a test objectively good?
A good test is something that looks at it from a user's standpoint and understands what the user is trying to accomplish and creates a scenario that allows you to test it from the user's perspective. So it's all well and good that you built it correctly and it does do what it says on the tin. But if what the user is trying to do can't be done, or it requires a step that you didn't think about, that creates a problem. I did an exercise one time with one of the better QA teams that I've worked with. And we had, when I was at Home Advisor, we had a very, very reliable and impressive DevOps process where we released every 2 weeks, and 2 days before the releases, we would have a release meeting, and anything that didn't make it would get pulled out, and we could actually pull things from active releases successfully and still build and deploy. Absolutely phenomenal build pipeline process. It was awesome. But one of the things that we would do is every 2 weeks on Thursday night, we would have somebody on our team would be responsible, usually one of the senior people, would be responsible for doing the release QA. We're doing a release that's tested in production to make sure it's correct. And so we had a release process document that says, okay, for the QA people, here's the process that we do, right? This is exactly the set of steps that we do, and everybody ostensibly follows that. And so I ran an experiment and said, okay, every time you do it, you can work off the document, but what I want you to do on the side is create a separate, every single action that you do, I want you to record every action that you do from a testing perspective. What are all the steps necessary? What are we doing to test it? And we did it over I can't remember, it was 4 or 5 different people that did this. Not one single document was the same. Every single one of them were different.
Wow.
Even though we had a starting document that said this is what is intended, these are the steps. They all had slightly different things because of things that they knew about the product, because of their experience, whatever the case may be. Every single one of them had differences in the document. Yes, I would say 70%, 75% of it was the same, but there were things that this person did and this person didn't do, or 2 of them would do this and the other 3 didn't do that. Or there were things that they just completely diverged at some points. And to me, that was very telling because clearly the test, if you will, that we had written for production purposes wasn't a good test because it didn't take into account all of these variations and things that need to be considered. That's an example of when you need to make sure that you fully understand the full scope of what you're doing and actually documenting that, like making sure that you're actually keeping track of all of the things, because that's one of the things that tends to happen with us as individuals is we sit down and start to do something and we're like, oh, you do this, you do this, you do this, you do this. But then you watch them do that, and while they might have documented 7 steps, they actually do 10 things. But those other 3 things they do on autopilot. Like they don't even think about them. And so it's being aware of those kinds of things and making sure you're capturing those, because you may not always be the one testing them. And the outcome, if you skip those 3 steps, may be completely different depending on who's doing the testing. It's a long-winded way. Hopefully that answers what.
Yeah, it does. It's kind of there's kind of like a regression in your regression. If you're regression testing, then there's a regression in how you're regression testing. Right?
It is, and I think it's. But one of the things that did after that exercise, it forced people to really step back and think about like the specific actions that they were taking, like what the intent of the testing was. And one of the things that as part of that exercise we decided on is the functional testing needs to be much more precise and much more defined, because we have a specific set of requirements that this has to accept. And so that list of tests could just keep growing. But the same thing was happening to our regression suite, because what we were doing is taking those functional tests and pushing them over to regression, saying, okay, every time we run regression, we need to test all these things. And that suite just kept growing. It was getting into the thousands. And that's just not reasonable and feasible to get through. But when we stepped back and looked at it, we realized, okay, from a regression standpoint, and the things that we need to test, let's look at it from the user standpoint. And these are the expectations of the system from a user standpoint, and from a every feature that's in there, these are the things that we're supposed to be able to do, et cetera. That's a fixed set of things, right? The system as a whole, regardless of how many changes you go through or bug fixes or tweaks, whatever, the core functionality, unless you're adding new functionality or sunsetting old functionality, right? That's a very fixed set of things that needs to be done. Your regression suite should be pretty well defined. You shouldn't need to be adding or changing. But what you should be doing is documenting the users, like how they're going to be using the system through that process. That will make your life much easier because you'll be much less reliant and dependent on changes causing problems downstream, because what you're trying to do is, can I as the user do this thing? The specifics of how I do that thing is less important once you get to regression and user acceptance kind of thing, because the how is less important than the, can I period. Like, is that something that's doable period? That helped us a lot in that regard, because then we started looking at it and framing the whole conversation around testing just differently.
Yeah. A lot of what you're saying makes me think that there needs to be quite a close bond between QA and BA. Is that accurate?
Yeah, in fact, I would say you go to a lot of organizations, especially outside of the Salesforce world. I mean, it's depending on the team, kind of true in the Salesforce world, but certainly outside of the Salesforce world, the most knowledgeable person about your system, period, there's two people. The number one person is typically the QA person. The number two person is the BA. But the BA understands the intent behind it, whereas the QA understands the actual reality of it. Those two need to be very closely aligned, to your point, right? Whether it's a BA or a product owner, they need to be very tightly coupled, so that is a very clear understanding of the differences between the two. They should be in lockstep, but they're not always, as much as I would like them to be. They're often not, and so the two need to be working hand in hand to make sure that that's understood.
Yeah. If you had a blank sheet of paper, I guess, and walked into an organization that had a Salesforce org that's, I guess, 5 years old, number of customizations, custom code, flows, business processes, and all they have is the required unit testing. The only thing that is actually the thing that you have to do. What's the steps that you take to start to implement a robust test strategy or QA strategy?
Yeah, so I mean, the first thing I'm going to look at is, what is the core set of functionality that we need to be testing? Who are our users? What are they trying to do with our system? And kind of mapping out what those user personas look like. Because from that, I can back into a good testing process. And whether that's just the regression testing, or whether I need to do security testing, I need to do performance testing, I need to do volume testing, whatever that looks like along the way. How much automation am I going to need? I have to start with understanding what the actual user scenarios are that I'm going to have to work with. And before I get there, I have to understand who my users are. And so the first thing I'm going to do is start there, back into what user scenarios I have. And then once I know kind of that baseline of, okay, this is what I'm going to have to do over time, then I'm going to stop and say, okay, what testing have you historically done? Okay, you're just doing the unit testing. Cool. Do you have a person on the teams that would be the person when you release something, who makes sure that what you released is valid, right? Whether you consider that testing or not, who's that person that's checking the box and says, we're done with this thing fully, right? Because somebody has to be doing that. If not, all bets are off. But finding out who that person is and talking to them and understanding, okay, what have you been doing to this point? How do we map what you're doing to this point to what we're doing here, and what needs to happen here? Close that gap. And then understand, okay, for every development team, do we have a person that can play that role in the short term just to start getting some measure of quality in place? That's where I would start, is just coming up with a plan to cover the things that need to be covered, and understanding what those things are. I've got a whole deck on where and what I would do as part of it, building a good test strategy. A lot of it is, I work for a test automation company. I'm a big proponent of test automation, but sometimes it's not good, to your point and question from earlier, it's not good to just jump right into automation, right? You kind of need to figure out where you're at first and get some semblance of a good starting point and baseline to work off of in order for the other things to be successful. There's certainly a continuum. It's not a binary 0 or 1 on those things. There's a scale in between there, and just working through each one of those layers is important.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And something that I've heard mentioned quite frequently, certainly in more recent times, last couple of years, I do honestly feel that this topic has kind of blown up over the last 5 years or so. It's kind of grown in weight.
You're welcome for that. Because I think I was one of the few people, started that charge at Provar. We were, that was a big reason for it. And at the time, there weren't a lot of people doing testing within the Salesforce ecosystem. So, I love that has become a conversation, because at the time, the thing that we were driving towards was, we wanted to level the whole space up, and it kind of feels like that's happened. It's one of those things that it doesn't really feel like it's having an impact. It's taken a long time, but then you look back, like you said, 5 years later, it's like, oh wow, we've come a long way just as a space. This is now a topic that people are talking about for real, with some semblance of knowledge, and that's a pretty cool thing.
That is a good thing. But to where I was getting to is something that corrupts up more and more is the shift left ideology. Hey, tell me a little bit about your thoughts on that.
My thoughts on shift left. I think it's a noble goal, but I don't think it works as well in the Salesforce space as it does within the standard development space outside of Salesforce, simply because of the way development teams are constructed for the most part, and kind of the expectations on them and the resources available to them. Shift left tends to be something, the idea behind it is, at its purest sense, doing exactly what I said at the very beginning of what QA is starting as early as possible, during the ideation phase if possible, certainly during story planning, things like that. That is, at its purest sense, what it's supposed to be. The way it's interpreted is, we need to be doing automation as early in the process as possible, which means developers write code, we write automation tomorrow, right? Love the thought. It's not really feasible outside of really, really super strong technical teams. And what I mean by that is both the developer and the QA people have really strong technical skills and can be in lockstep. I've seen that happen in a very, very small number of instances where that's successful. It just requires so much coordination between the two teams. It's just really hard to be effective. So the shift left thing, well, at its heart, is supposed to be a good thing, and the idea behind it is a good thing. There's a lot of people that misunderstand what it means, and so they take the term without really taking the meaning behind the term, and they try and apply the term, and that kind of misses the point.
And there you have it. That's I guess it all comes back to kind of a theme through this podcast, because we've been talking, is having that baseline understanding of what testing is and QA is in the first place, and then working from there to understand where you are and where you want to get to.
We used to call it a journey. I mean, that's still my, what's your quality journey look like? Where are you at on that journey? Because no two people are at the same place. No two journeys are the same. And there's no right starting point. There's no wrong starting point.
Just start, right?
just get started, and don't be afraid to ask questions. Be willing to ask for help. What I would say is the QA community, for the most part, is a very helpful community, and they genuinely want to help each other. There's a lot of places that you can go and ask for help, whether it's LinkedIn, whether it's Reddit, whether it's there's a test automation trailhead that you can go and ask, right? All these places are great places to start, but like you said, just get started. Like take it seriously and treat it as a thing that needs to be taken seriously.
Yeah. Well, it's at the end of the day, it's looking after all of the users that rely on Salesforce as a tier 1 business application every day, right?
Well, so something you just said is actually, especially in the Salesforce world, something that is often goes unnoticed and unconsidered when a lot of people are thinking about, oh, well, you're doing this, and so this must mean this kind of thing. Salesforce testing, largely has two different types of applications. There's the ones that are external facing, your end customers, right? The end users. But there's also the internal applications, which is, believe it or not, the largest amount of Salesforce development that actually happens. It's not externally facing things. A lot of it is internally facing, right? Helping your business operate. And so the users are all your internal people. Well, the problem to that is those internal people, in most cases, I would say, the largest majority of cases, don't generate revenue, which means you're going to think about them and consider them last when it comes to what you need to do to support them. Even though you've spent potentially millions of dollars on Salesforce, well, it's just for our internal users. It's not that important, right? If something goes wrong, it's just our internal people. But what happens if your internal people can't do their job? And that job is what delivers the money at the end of the day, right? That's a different conversation, but it's often disconnected from our users are our people, so it's okay if something goes wrong. We're willing to take the hit on that. If it was a customer, right, the customer facing one's a different story. They're largely treated a much different way, but it is a thing that has to be considered as part of the conversation. Is this an internal development project, right? Is this something for you as a business, or is this something that is going to be used by the external public facing? Could this hurt your reputation? If the answer to that is no, but if they can't do their job, then that might cost you money. You might still want to reconsider that.
Yeah. Jon, you shared a lot of knowledge and a lot of insight into testing and why testing is important, and given kind of a baseline framework for people how to think of it. What is kind of like last piece of advice for people to get started? Where do they take? They've listened to this conversation. They're at this point now. Where do they go next? And what's the next step for them in their quality journey?
I would start with the stuff that's on Trailhead, and go and look at the things that are there, because there's some good content that's specifically targeted at the Salesforce ecosystem. But there's a number of good places that are out there. There's Test Guild that does a lot of good testing information, general testing. There is Ministry of Testing. There's a number of really good resources from a quality and testing perspective that allow you to kind of start to understand and interact with other people within the quality space. There needs to be more specifically geared towards quality. It's one of the reasons why we're going to be starting a QA specific conference at Test Sigma. It's not a Test Sigma conference. It's a QA conference for the Salesforce community, because there's not really a community for testing within Salesforce land. It's a bunch of disparate, independent people that are looking for answers and help. So we're going to try and help in that regard. Similar to, the University of Provar was one aspect. We're doing something similar at Test Sigma to help continue that ball rolling. We're going to add some community content, because people need to interact and talk to other people and not get caught in this is how we've always done it, so this is how we're going to keep doing it. Ask questions, be inquisitive, be creative.
Create the voice for testing in Salesforce. Yeah. Salesforce even more.
Be that voice. Don't be afraid to use your voice. Stand up, raise your hand. If it's not good enough, say that. You might not be listened to, but at least somebody said that. And sometimes that's the thing that a lot of people don't really consider is, all it takes is somebody to just voice that. Whether it's listened to or not, at least somebody voiced it, and at least you can have a fighting chance. But if nobody says anything, right, you're obviously not going to change anything.
Absolutely. Jon, where can people find you?
LinkedIn's probably the best place to find me. I'm on the app formerly known as Twitter as well, under Jumpman COL. But I don't do a ton of content there. Most of my content's out on LinkedIn, so I would probably look for me there. And if you have questions, feel free to reach out.
And at the many community conferences that you are now attending.
If you're at a Salesforce conference, there's a very high likelihood that I will be there floating around, whether as a sponsor or as just an attendee and being back in the ecosystem. So, yeah.
Perfect. Jon, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for sharing your knowledge with the listeners. Listeners, I hope you've enjoyed this. Jon, happy Thanksgiving to you, because this episode is out on Thanksgiving Day. So hopefully everybody's enjoying their turkey and maybe listen to this in a food coma. So
yeah, there you go.
All right. Thank you, listeners. And see you on another episode sometime soon.